The first sign that something was wrong wasn't a scream, a strange figure, or a sound in the darkness. It was a missing wallet. At the time, I had no idea that one small absence would become the first clue that someone was moving through the wilderness with me. Last summer, I decided to take on a major section of the Pacific Crest Trail. I'd always loved hiking, and solo trips were something I genuinely enjoyed. There was something about being out there alone, surrounded by nothing but trees, mountains, and miles of trail that felt almost therapeutic. My plan was simple. I'd park my car at the end of the section, catch a ride to the trailhead, and hike back to my car over a little more than a week and a half. It sounded straightforward. The first few days were exactly what I'd expected. Towering trees surrounded the trail, their branches forming long stretches of shade overhead. The path wound through quiet landscapes where the only sounds were my own footsteps, the occasional bird, and the wind moving through the trees. I was in pretty good shape, so I didn't need to stop often. But there was one rule I never ignored. I wasn't going to hike in the dark. Every evening, I found somewhere to pitch my tent and settle in for the night. I also preferred to keep a low profile. Solo hikers can attract attention, and I didn't like the idea of someone casually wandering into my campsite. So each night, I'd move a little ways off the trail before setting up. It seemed safer. By the third night, everything had been completely normal. Then I woke up in the middle of the night with a feeling I couldn't explain. Something was wrong. There was no obvious sound. Nothing inside the tent looked disturbed. But that instinctive warning was strong enough that I couldn't ignore it. I slowly looked around. Everything appeared exactly where I'd left it. Still, I decided to check outside. I drew my rifle, grabbed my flashlight, and carefully unzipped the tent. The campsite was empty. At least, nobody was visible. I swept the flashlight across the surrounding trees, the ground, and the darkness beyond my small camp. Nothing. I went back inside and began checking my pack. That's when I noticed it. My wallet was gone. At first, I convinced myself I'd misplaced it. Maybe I'd left it outside. Maybe it had slipped somewhere inside my gear. I searched everything. Nothing. And eventually, one possibility became harder to ignore. Someone had taken it. The wallet bothered me because it didn't make sense. Why would someone sneak into my campsite, take my wallet, and leave everything else untouched? There was cash inside, credit cards, personal information, but nothing else appeared to be missing. For a while, I told myself I'd probably lost it. Misplacing things was unusual for me, but it was still easier to believe than the alternative. Then the small things started disappearing. Over the next few days, I noticed that one of my lighters was gone, then my Swiss Army knife, then several energy bars. None of those things were particularly valuable. That was almost what made it worse. They seemed random. I knew I wasn't simply forgetting where I'd put them. Too many things were disappearing, and by the fourth day, I could no longer explain it away. Someone was taking my belongings. Someone was getting close enough to my campsite to do it. And suddenly, the solitude I'd loved so much felt completely different. There was no cell coverage in that part of the trail. I couldn't simply call someone and explain what was happening. I couldn't send my location. There was no easy way to ask for help. I remember thinking about turning around, but that didn't really solve anything. I was still several days from my car. Whether I continued forward or turned back, I'd have to sleep somewhere. And I didn't want to pitch my tent in those woods knowing that somebody might be watching. It felt like there was no good choice. So I tried to remain calm. I reminded myself why I'd brought a rifle. Then another thought occurred to me. Why hadn't they taken it? If someone had already been inside my campsite, they could have taken the gun. But they hadn't. That was when the situation began to feel deliberate. Almost as if whoever was out there wasn't interested in stealing anything important. Almost as if they were trying to let me know they could get close whenever they wanted. That night, I tied the tent shut from the inside. I stayed awake as long as I could, listening to every movement outside. Eventually, exhaustion won. When morning came, I was still inside. Nothing appeared to have disturbed the tent. There was no obvious sign anyone had returned. But the damage had already been done. The fear had gotten into my head. From that point on, every sound became a warning. A rustle in the bushes made me stop walking. A flicker of movement at the edge of my vision made me turn around. And sometimes, there was absolutely nothing there. I knew that, but knowing it didn't make the fear disappear. Then something happened that made me question whether I could still trust my own senses. I remember one hallucination more clearly than all the others. I was walking along the trail when suddenly my foot came down into what felt like an ankle-deep puddle. I nearly stumbled. I heard the splash. I felt cold water soak through my sock. The sensation was so convincing that I immediately looked down. The ground was completely dry. No puddle. No water. Nothing. I stood there staring at the dirt, trying to understand what had just happened. But there was no explanation. The strange experiences continued, and the longer I stayed out there, the worse my mind seemed to become. The days were difficult. The nights were unbearable. Every evening, I tied my tent shut from the inside and kept my rifle beside me. I tried to convince myself that I was protected. It didn't work. At one point, I had to splash cold water onto my face just to calm myself down. Afterward, the hallucinations mostly subsided, but I still didn't know what was real anymore. Then, one night, I woke up to footsteps. They were outside my tent. Someone was walking around my campsite. I stayed completely still. My hand found the rifle. I held it tightly, preparing myself for whoever was out there. But I couldn't move. My body seemed frozen by fear. The footsteps continued for what felt like an eternity. Then they slowly faded away into the woods. I didn't sleep again. As soon as the sun came up, I started packing. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely tie my gear together. I couldn't spend another night there. I was close to the end now, probably a day and a quarter from my car, maybe less if I moved quickly. So I made a decision. I wasn't stopping. I would hike through the night if I had to. Anything was better than spending another night in those woods. I walked for hours, pushing myself as hard as my body allowed. Eventually, the sun began to disappear. Normally, that would have been the moment when I stopped and made camp. This time, I kept going. By the time darkness completely settled over the trail, I was still moving. I estimated I had maybe 2 hours left. I switched on my flashlight. My rifle stayed in my other hand. For the first time in my life, I was hiking through the wilderness in complete darkness. I quickly discovered that it was far more difficult than I'd imagined. Every tree looked different. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound seemed closer than it really was. I kept walking. I focused on my breathing and tried not to think about what might be behind me. Then, about an hour later, I heard something. Footsteps. Somewhere behind me. I stopped, turned around, and aimed my flashlight into the darkness. That's when I saw something move behind a tree.